All right, everyone, this is going to be exciting. This is a really neat new feature. So we're going to walk you through the basics of what a dashboard is, and then we're going to make some examples, and then we're going to show off some examples, and we're going to try and save some time for questions too. This is the newest thing coming out in BRM 6.7. What you're going to see is the result of a combination of the task force working on some parts of this and some parts donated by Michigan. And the two of them together kind of means now that the sky is the limit for dashboards. This is fun stuff. Okay, so I'm going to start by walking you through kind of the default of what a dashboard is. My other panelist here, Kenny, is the developer who worked on a large portion of this, and so he will also be able to help answer some questions. He'll be explaining some stuff too as we go through. But all right, I'm going to start with the default dashboard. This one you will see, this comes with BRM 6.7 out of the box. You have the option to, like any other page, make this available or disable it. So I'm going to show you some of the different features on this first. And this is a good example of the things that this can do. So first off, you'll see here these counts. So I have like the count of how many bridges are on the NHS or not on the NHS, good, fair, and poor. These numbers are live. This is, when I pulled up the page, this is how many there were in the database. And so this is not, I mean, it's kind of like being able to run a crystal report without having to run the report, right? And then down here, you'll see that I've got like the structure types. So I've got how many are stringer girder, how many are culvert, and so on. And if I click on this, it even breaks it down. This one's breaking it down into on and off the NHS. See, and I can go back to overall. My good, fair, and poor. Of those poor bridges, how many are on or off the NHS? You know, like I can dig down into it. Over here, I have how many of my bridges are posted or not by district. And let's say, you know, I'm not really interested in like the open ones. I want to see the posted ones. By clicking on them down here in the legend, I can turn off some of those and see in more detail. I'm looking in particular for the posted ones, for example. So there's a lot of neat things you can do, both with the numbers and the graphs. And then also, as I'm scrolling down here further, so our default one has, you know, how many bridges had a due date that their inspection was due in the last 3 months or 2 months ago or this month. And as I click on those, it's going to change this grid down below to show me which bridges are those 48. And if I want to see which one that is, like I can select it and put it on the map and see which bridge are we talking about. And that brings it up. Which one are we talking about? There's even the ability to run some reports from here. That's not set up right now, but that's okay. Like, man, there are some options in this. It's really exciting. So this is the overall, the things that a dashboard can do. But now we're going to get into more adventures specifically about making a dashboard. You're able to configure your own dashboards for what your state needs it to do. There's not a limit really on how many of these you can make. So you can make a lot of dashboards if you'd like. And that's exactly what we're going to walk you through next. So the first step that I recommend when making a new dashboard is to go through and kind of sketch out what you would like it to look like. So here I'm going to show you a hideous sketch that I made in Word. And I'm realizing now that I'm only sharing. So here we go, my hideous Word sketch. All right, I want to make a dashboard for this example that has the number of bridges that need a new load rating. Okay, and I maybe want a graph that breaks them up by owners so that I can see like which ones are state owned and you know, locally owned, and maybe by structure type. So I want, you know, are they girder, are they suspension bridges, are they culverts, what kind of load ratings am I looking at, so that I can find the ones that I need to go through perhaps and bring up in BRR to do a load rating on. And then the details, kind of like this grid that we were just looking at that had the details. So this is roughly what I'm going to try to make. And the reason I do the drawing first is so that I see high level, what is it that I'm trying to accomplish? All right. So let's go back to BRM now. So the adventure here is, if I'm going to, actually, before I leave this, it looks like I just got a question here. Can the user change how the fair condition is defined? For those who use 5 instead of 5 and 6? Good question. The answer basically, Jason, is that yes, in some places, depending on how you go about it. I'll show you where that part comes up in a little bit. In like this graph just leans on the default one, and no, it would not be an option on the default graph, but it's all right. We'll get to that. Good question. Okay, so I'm going to be going to the admin and the visual dashboard editor. Sometimes that can be a mouthful, kind of like the visual form editor. This one has been abbreviated internally at times to be the VDE. And if you hear us talk about the VDE, we're talking about the dashboard editor. Okay. So I'm going to create a new one here. I'm going to name this the load ratings example. We're talking about bridges, but you'll notice that for my other asset types, like I can make a dashboard for tunnels or for signs. Where do I want to show this to show up in the menu? I'm going to have this show up on the bridges list. So it's going to be under bridges and in here when I'm done. Okay. Title, I'm going to call this the load rating example works, and go ahead and show that. And this is the neat stuff that Kenny has put in a lot of effort. Kenny and company have on this. Notice that like it showed up as soon as I clicked the box. I can see exactly what's going on when I click through it and make those changes. Okay. So looking at my drawing, I now know that I kind of want 3 sections. And I have the different sections here. I can have the normal ones, which are just always open, or the collapsible ones that will, like, it can start closed and you can expand it for more information if you want. For now, I'm going to just make a normal block that's going to be my load ratings. I'm going to add another section, which is my graphs. And then I'm going to add one more that is a normal block for my details. Okay, so 3 groups: the load ratings, the graphs, and the details that I'm going to be creating here. Okay. Now I'm going to go in and start with, on the load ratings part, I want to add a control. Okay, so here are the different types of controls that I can make. So I have that I can make the filter grid, which was kind of like those grids you were seeing at the top of the default that had the numbers I could click on. The drop downs, which I'm going to talk about in just a minute. Empty blocks, if I want something to like hold spaces between them, then I can show you how empty blocks can come up in a little bit. The table grid was like that big details thing. We're going to be using one of those a little later, and then a chart control. These are the different types of controls I can add. So right now I'm going to start with a filter grid, and I'm going to name this one, well, this is the bridges that need load ratings. And maybe I'll give the label that is the same. The width, how big do I want it to be? 4 columns. You can see this goes up to 12 columns. 12 columns is essentially the full width of the page. Right now, 4 works just fine for my purposes, but that's, if I want to make them very skinny or very wide, that's how I would adjust them. Okay. So now I'm going to go ahead and save this, and you'll see that it shows up right here, the bridges that need load ratings. And this is where I realized, maybe I want to capitalize the T and the N, and I want to adjust that. Like I can just adjust those and save that. And look, it fixed it. All right, now to the adventurous stuff. I'm going to open my grid configuration. So I'm going to say on this one that I just wanted, I wanted 2 parts. So I'm going to add a column. This first one is going to be my label. And I just want the label, to say bridges that need load ratings, right? I could even do this one. Let's say the count of bridges is what I want it to say, because I've already got that it says bridges that need load ratings there. All right. And then this one, if I just leave it as a label at first and save it, you will see, oh, it didn't like that because I didn't give it a name yet. Do this real quick. So if I save this, you'll see that I come up with, it says the count of bridges. And then right now, because I didn't change that one, it just says custom label. All right. But so that's like, if I just wanted to put the text in, you can see I can add text however I'd like, whether that's a whole bunch of headings or if I wanted to add a bunch of rows. Now I'm going to get a little more complex. We're going to add that count part. So this part I'm going to add filter count and configure it. And now a few different parts are going to show up. I'm going to start with the most basic query here, and then Kenny's going to walk us through a few more of like the things you can do that are advanced. So
yeah, if you don't mind, I can just
oh, you
talk
can
about
start
this.
while I type it. Do it.
Yeah, I'll just talk about this whole control. So the filter count SQL control is basically where you're going to decide the behavior of the table grid and what's going to show in the filter grid. So those two controls communicate a lot. So starting with the name field, I highly suggest that you name this control the same as your label that is right next to it, because what's going to happen is when the filter SQL query is loaded in the table grid, this field, the name field, is going to show at the top of the table grid, and that'll make more sense when you see it in action. The next thing to look at is the default checkbox. So if you have a filter grid with a bunch of different filter counts equals, it's showing a bunch of values, you can choose one of those to automatically load in the table grid on page load. So you open up your dashboard and you want it to automatically load up all bridges or any kind of filter you want. So that's how you set that. Only one filter count per grid can be set as the default, because obviously you're only going to have one loading in a table grid. Then just taking a quick look at filter variables down here. What are those? Bridge with access is what we call our access filter. I'll talk about that more in a minute. We're going to use that to basically replace the bridge table with the bridges that the user has access to through their group access filters. And then we have some global filters like current user, selected bridge, etc. And those are pretty self-explanatory. If we want to create a SQL query that uses data from the current user or wants to pull data about the selected bridge, we can use that in our query, and then what shows in this filter grid and in the table when we click on it is going to reflect the bridge that's actually selected globally. So it'll change. If you close your dashboard, go back to the bridge list and select another bridge and bring your dashboard back, it'll change depending on what's selected. So it's kind of dynamic in that way. We'll talk about how to use those in just a second. So just a quick word about the SQL requirements box up there. There are some small differences between the SQL you'll put in here and what you'll use in an editor. Most notable being that in order for group access filters to be applied, you will replace your main asset table, which in this case would be bridge, with that bridge with access variable. And then also in the filter SQL, the column bridge GUID as key is required. The table grid basically just uses that to know how to load your data up into the table. And then there is some functionality we have kind of baked in where you can turn this structure number column into links that go to the inspection condition page in the for that bridge. And in order to opt into that functionality, you just need to follow that second point under filter SQL, column struct num as struct num. And that will become more clear as we actually do it. So go ahead and Zach, go ahead and bring in some SQL for our filter query.
Sure. All right. I was just going to point out with a switch of what I'm sharing for a second that when it comes to actually writing the queries, I recommend going and testing them in a query writer first. So in this case, like my count, I went through and made sure that it was giving me the count that I expected and just returns one result because that's what's going to show up in the numbers. And then same for like my filter query, it's going to go and return the columns that I'm expecting for my filter, so that if there's any problems with the SQL, if there are any errors that need to be returned about, hey, you spelt something wrong, that column doesn't exist, you get that feedback wherever you're building your query first. And then you can bring these back over to BRM, basically.
Yeah, and definitely recommend doing that just because the dashboards editor doesn't give you much information if your query fails. It basically just tells you, hey, your query failed. So any troubleshooting will need to happen in an actual editor where you're querying against your database. All right, and then Zach, if you want to click and drag and expand that text box so we can see everything that's in it.
This here we go.
All right, so as you can see, we've got our select bridge GUID as key, that we've met that requirement for the filter SQL. And we're also doing the struct num to get that link in the structure number column. So once we've done that, we can essentially just set all of the columns that we want to see in our details table. And we do that by just bringing in columns from the table, and then we can alias them to make them look nicer. So the alias is what's going to show up in the column header for each of these columns. Right. So right now we're selecting these columns from bridge, aliasing it as B, and then where rec op rat it equals 1. So there's one thing we need to do here if we want to limit the access to the bridges that the user has access to through their group access filters, or I guess that's just a long way of saying apply the group access filters. So what we're going to do is just highlight bridge, go over to our filter variables, select bridge with access, and then click add to filter. And as you can see, since we had bridge highlighted, it just replaced it with that access filter. We don't have to memorize, what to put in those double curly brackets. It just automatically puts it in there. And now that query, when we apply this filter to the table grid, the group access filters will be applied. So we're going to go ahead and do that also with our scalar SQL.
Now, just for those of you who haven't worked with filters or worked with access filters a lot, what this means is if a District 1 person only has access to District 1 bridges, when they load this, it would bring up the count and the grid of just the District 1 bridges that they have access to. And that way, like if District 2 people get in, then it brings up the count of District 2 for them. Like it pares this down to just what they have access to. So for those of you who work with, maybe you don't give the inspectors or the field people access to bridges that are no longer in service, that will remove them from the count so that they don't have to worry about them, for example.
Yep. Yeah, and that's automatically done with whatever user's logged in. So that's the only change you have to make in this query is applying the group access filters and then create the group access filters and apply them to the users elsewhere. There was one other thing I was going to say. Right. So you can also notice that the access filter can be aliased. So in the filter SQL, we're aliasing it with B. If we don't alias it, it automatically gets aliased as bridge. Or if you're in a different asset, it's whatever word comes before underscore with underscore access. So if you left out that B, it would be automatically aliased as bridge, and we could use that to point to columns elsewhere in the query. And I think that's all I've got for now. We're gonna come back here in just a bit, but I'll let Zach take it back over.
All right, so we'll save that, and it brings up the count of bridges that need load rating. So these are the bridges that have my load rating recommended box is checked. So that's set to 1. That was what was in that query, is that if it required rating, if that equaled 1, then they were brought back. So to that prior question about could you make counts like this that find bridges where the deck rating is 5 instead of where it is fair? Yeah, you would just change your query to look for bridges where the value is 5 instead of where the value is 5 or 6. We're leaning on one of those other fields. So yes, that is how you would make that change that we were talking about earlier. Okay, so that's my first part, putting in the count there. Next, I am going to go and get my graphs. While I am pulling up the graphs, there is another question there about the types of SQL. Kenny, if you'd like to answer that one.
You know, I'm not 100% certain. I'm going to say probably not the more advanced features of PL SQL or Transact SQL. There's some stuff done to your query after, you know, when it goes to, especially when it goes to the filter grid, it's actually going to become a subquery, and we're doing things to it. So I would say, you know, for the more advanced queries that you might want to try, just kind of use a trial and error. And if you have any specific, you know, specific queries that you might want to try, you can always run them by us, and we can come back with a better answer than what I have right now.
I will say, Joseph, I learned because at the bottom of the page, it comes up with like the count of how many there are on this page. There's 16 bridges on the list. Like in the table that I'm going to use later, I found that it doesn't work with like with statements or pivot statements, things like that, because it's going to nest the query as a subquery to fill in some of those things later. So that does kind of limit a bit what kinds of SQL you can use. But I found that I tried to do it and then it didn't work, and I discovered that really quickly. Okay, types of graphs. So in this case, I went not to the dashboard editor, but to the VDE chart templates. I went in here and looked at the types of charts that there were. In this case, I've got one I've already created where I said that, hey, the name is going to be the load rating by owner, chart title, you know, rating needs by owner. And I said it was going to be a pie chart, but you'll see that I've got column and bar charts and stacked column charts. And like, I could look at what kinds of charts those are going to give me and find the one that I'm looking for. In this case, I wanted a pie chart that has the different owner types. And so what is my X parameter here? It's going to be the owner. So it's going to have, you know, what are the state owned and county owned and city owned and so on. That trick that I did where I clicked on it to see on and off the NHS, that's this second field here. So if I wanted to be able to do that on this one as well, to like break out on and off the NHS, then I would scroll down this list until I found my NHS indicator, which is it's roadway.nhs indicator, that one. So like that's how you could subdivide that if you wanted to, so that users could click on it to get more information. I'm not going to modify this one right now because that's got what I want. And then I make the second one, same thing, that I'm doing it by design type. So at this time I'm using the design main instead of the owner. But it's basically the same concept. If I wanted to do them by like what district they're in, you know, which region, if I want to do them what county they're in, you just make graphs like this. Once I've made that template, once it's in this list, then it's available for me to use on that other page. So you can see the ones that I've got here pretty much are those load rating ones that I just created, and the ones that are on the default page. Those are the templates that have been created to this point. So now I'm going to go back to the editor and go back to my load rating example. And here is where I'm now going to add a control. And this one is going to be a chart control. And which chart in particular am I going to use? I'm going to use the load rating by owner. Oh, and I have to name it. Ta-da, rating needs by owner. All right. Then I'm going to add another one here. Also a chart control, and I'm going to use the load ratings by design type. Okay, so now I've got my two graphs. There's a question there about how do you, oh, the question went away. So I guess it may have been answered already. That's okay. All right.
I just typed an answer because I think you answered it when you talked about the VD chart templates and then went into the control properties. But
okay.
But yeah, let us know if that didn't fully answer your question.
And we're going to do a few more tricks with it in just a minute too, with this example. Okay, the last piece that I wanted to add now is that I want to add my bridge table grid. And I'm going to say, you know, what controls what things show up in this grid. I'm going to say it's the bridges that need load ratings. But then also, you know, you could click on the charts here and get it to show up in that grid as well. Now, do I want the ability to map those bridges? I'm going to say yes. Do I want to be able to run reports from this? For now, let's say no. I don't want to be able to run reports from here. So I'm going to uncheck that one. I'm just going to call this the details. I'm not going to worry about showing the label right now. And this should give me now my table down below. So the columns that are showing up here are being driven by the columns that I set in that query that's behind this number 16. Okay, so the 16 bridges are the bridges that I said where the load rating recommended equals 1. And sure enough, you can see load rating review recommended equals 1. That brings up these ones. Then there's a question here. How come this count is so much higher than the 16? That's because this is all of the bridges. This is all of the bridges right now by their owner in my inventory. I'm going to get to in just a minute. I'm going to filter this down if I want this to reflect the number that's given on that one. I'm going to show you how to do that in just a second. How do you tell the chart? Mark's question is the same. I'm about to get to that one. Okay, in fact, this may be the time to get to that. So let's say that I want the charts to be limited and I want the count of bridges to be limited down. And let's say that I don't know, let's say I don't want to hard code it to always equal 1. Let's say I want to be able to see those where it's not recommended or those where it is recommended. All right, so this brings us back to one of those other control types up here, the drop-down filter. So this one's going to be my load rating recommended status. Yeah, it's the load rating needed. Okay, so for this one, I could either have the list of this drop down, and I'm going to, back here, let's do this. Let's close this for a second. Let's drag this one over so it goes first. So I select if I want the load ratings where it is or isn't recommended, and then I want everything else to change. All right, going back to, I have to save now that I've moved it. All right. I can say that the option in this dropdown can be options that I will give it. And then I can say your options are A, yes, it's recommended, B, it's not recommended, and B includes, like, you know, I can set that. And I could write my query here, getting ahead of myself. I could write that query to expect those, or I can go and just use the parameters. For this example, load rating review recommended doesn't come with parameters by default. but I went and created some parameters for it that are just a parameter for 0 and for 1 so that it would show up with what I needed. That's not going to affect inspection at all because in inspection, it's just a checkbox. So there's a 0 and a 1, doesn't need parameters. So I'm going to use the parameters that I created for this one. So now I've got load rating review recommended or no review recommended, or if there's negative ones, then it's data that needs fixing. Okay. Now that I've added this drop down, I've got to go back through the other things that I've created and tell them to respect the results of that drop down. I'm going to start with this query first. So I'm going to go into my query here. I'm going to edit those and see. So like right here, right now it's written to just where does this equal 1? And now I'm going to say, hey, use when the load rating recommended status. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to add that. Oops, I added that to this one. That's all right. Add it there, take out the 1, add it to the scalar, take out the 1.
Yep.
So
And
now
you'll notice that when that dropdown was created, it was automatically included in the filter variables that you see in the filter count SQL control. So any local filters that are introduced on the dashboard show up there. So it's like just a super handy way to be able to inject those the value from that into your query. So where that oh, and I was also gonna, if you can go back in that config.
Back to the edit. Yeah.
I was just going to say, don't be scared by what shows up in the query. It's this big, long, unique ID. That's why we have the filter variables on the left, so you can see that you can just add LR recommended status, and it'll automatically give you that long ID. And what that's going to do is when this query is run against the database, that control value inside those curly brackets is going to be replaced by the live value of that the dropdown is sending. And every time the dropdown changes, it will tell everything on the page that's listening to it to rerun their queries. And you'll see that in action here in a second.
Yep. All right. So now, for example, if I say load rating review recommended, there's 16. If I say no review recommended, it's the other bridges in the database. So that now switches as I toggle that. And I can now go through my others, like my graph, and say, hey, this graph now needs to respect the load rating recommended status. So now we'll bring it down to just the 16. And then let's say I want to do the same over here. This one should also follow that drop down. And now this will bring down to just my 16. So now as I toggle this, then I can see, the ones that don't need load ratings versus the ones that do need load ratings. All right. So hopefully, Mark and David, that answers your questions. You guys were just a step ahead of me. That is how you can get the graphs now to respect the same thing as the 16, as if they're following whatever this parameter is in this dropdown. And then, maybe I look at this and say that I don't want it to be 4 columns wide. I only want it to be 3 columns wide. Let's make it narrower, skinnier again. I don't know. I can mess with this until I get it to the shape that I want it. Sorry, Kenny, you were going to say something too.
Yeah, I was just going to mention it's hard to see, but when you change that dropdown, the table grid is also reloading because it is subscribed to a filter count that is reliant on that dropdown. So we kind of try to make it smart in that way that if your table grid is showing a filter count that is relying on a dropdown, it also changes when you change the dropdown. So just kind of trying to give you the data as fast as possible.
To show that other part I was talking about, this count down here, that there are 16 items in the page. This is where you run into, it's going to nest the query that I wrote into another query to fill out this. So that's why you can't use like width or pivot or some of those top level functions, because this is going to become a subquery basically. And you'll discover that. You may run into it yourself, and you see it pretty quickly and you go, oh, that's the thing where it can't have some functions, but it can still have subqueries and subqueries of its own, and you can get fancy and creative with that. Okay, So this page now is set up so that this would show, of all the bridges I have access to, how many of them have that checkbox checked right now that they need a new load rating. Okay. So now the last thing that remains is to go back to my admin and users, and I can go and set which users should land on that page when they log in. So I'm going to say, okay, when Zach logs in, he's now going to go to, and I need to refresh this page because I've now created a page. I'm going to say that he's going to go to bridges and the load rating example when he logs in. So now every time, and like you can do this, you can set this for your, all of your load raters, for example, when they get into BRM, they go straight to that load rating page. So rather than having to look at all of the, instead of having to land on the bridge list and then go find the bridges or find a filter that they need, this can just take them to the dashboard. They can see, hey, I want to see the 16 that I need, how many do I need to go work on? There's 16 I need to work on. I'm looking for the state-owned ones in particular. So I'm looking for just, a few of these. Like I can dig through this and find what are the particular bridges that need to be worked on.
And just a reminder,
yeah.
when you set your homepage or your landing page for a user, it also makes it so that the BRM logo in the top left brings you to that page. So if there's a page that you find yourself always wanting to navigate back to often, it's great to set that to your landing page, and then you can just use that logo. So, and you do have to refresh.
I guess I have to refresh, log out,
yeah.
back in, but I didn't know that.
Or your Pontus though, you changed it for Zach, so.
That's a good point. I'm logged in as Pontus instead of myself. I didn't know that. So that takes you to the page that your default is, your login is set to?
Yes,
landing page?
Yeah, that's it's a simple little new feature, but I find it super handy when I'm testing pages.
I learned a thing here too. Awesome. All right. Well, cool. Okay. I'm kind of expecting you guys to type in some questions now before I go show you even more examples from here. There's a good first question. Can the landing page be set by role? I'm trying to remember. I vaguely think so, but let me go check.
I don't know the answer to that one.
I don't remember. And things are changing so quickly these days that it's just easier to go look at the page and find out. This is the older role page. So no, in 6.7, not yet, I guess is the answer to Buck's question. It can't yet be set by role. I thought I've seen a concept. You may want to keep checking that as we go through the early 7 and 7.0 releases to see if that answer changes. How can you select all rather than either seeing the rating required or not? Okay, so in this case, I used a parameter. So the parameter has defined options, but if I used the list, then the list, if I guess here, let me show you what I'm talking about.
We may as well try it out.
Yeah, so if I were to do this, let's see, let me go back to my visual dashboard editor, load rating example. And okay, so in this one, right now, this is set to use the parameters. But if I want an option for like all, or where it equals 1, or where it equals 0, then this is where I would define a list. And I would add to this that I'm going to have like an everything where the value is like, let's say A. And then I'm going to add one where review recommended, where the value is 1.
I think you get your values in text reversed there. The value is the top box.
You're right. You're right. Look at that. man. But what I really like is that I'm going to find that out really quickly as soon as I try to run it, right?
Yes.
For those of you who've gone through the days where you used to have to like save and log out and log back in, the old navigation stuff, it's so much better than that. Those nightmares are in the past, in the dark days. Okay, so Catherine, for your question, in this case, if I like force feed it, these are the options in the drop down. Now it's going to fail at first for everything because it doesn't know what to do with the A, as opposed to like where it's expecting a 1. What I can then do is I can then come into this query and write my query that if, the value, like this thing equals 1, then it's, it's kind of you put in an or statement is what you do, where this thing equals A, then 1 equals 1, or this thing equals 1 and the field in question equals 1, or the value equals 0, something like that. So I guess you can have other options in your dropdown if you give it a list and then you write your query to expect those other values from the list. Does that make sense? Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, using the filter count as kind of a double-edged sword. We kind of give users just huge freedom to query for whatever you want, but with that comes some technical challenges sometimes. If you want to, for this case, you'd have to write your query to allow you to, change and essentially get all of them if it's a certain value. So yeah, I mean, requires a little bit of savviness with SQL, but in the long run, it gives you just huge freedom to write queries for whatever data you want.
Right. Okay. Good question. All right. Since I haven't seen a flood of other questions coming in just yet, to kind of help prime the pump of ideas, but really the sky is the limit from here. I'm going to show you some other dashboards that I've made. Actually, before I do, Harjeet has a good question. How many chart types are available and will more types be added in the future? Okay, yeah, so back to the chart types. We'll go back to the chart templates. So right now there are 4 chart types: the bar, column, so bar charts, column charts, pie charts, and stacked column charts. Will there be more available in the future? We designed this so that as states came up with other things that they wanted, it's very easy for them to add to the default going forward other chart types. So if you want a chart type that has like the flow of good, fair, poor from one year to the next over the last 10 years, or you want a chart type that does some things that take into account dates or inspection equipment needed, or I don't know, you have a very like custom thing that you need, or like a specific graph type that you want to add, it will become very cheap to add other chart types going forward. Drew here asks, what about line graphs? Yeah, so line graphs, the problem entirely becomes most line graphs want dates for the x-axis, and so far no one had given us an example of well, in the defaults that we were making, we didn't get into dates, like what kind of date rules were needed for the default ones. So this is a great example of, you guys are going to come up with more things from here, and we're going to add them as more chart types. And then I expect this drop-down list to grow as people come up with things that they want to add to it. Becky, I love how you're thinking. What about Venn diagrams to show overlapping portions of inventory? Yes, I love it. It would be pretty easy to add, but it's going to be a thing that you approach us about what requirements you want, and then we come up with the ways to try and add that in a way that's useful to everybody, and then we can, drop it into the next version of BRM from there. So, yeah, good question. Venn diagrams. Everyone's creative in this group. That's really cool. Okay, speaking of creative, let's go look at some creative other things we can do. So this one we made yesterday. This was a lot of fun. So we went and wrote a query for how many bridges have open work candidates. Okay, and then just kind of to show you this, it has different filters for. So like the query goes and finds just how many bridges have work candidates open on them, or I think the other one was like that has work candidates completed. But then the query that returns the results goes into the and looks up what are the work candidates. Okay, so let me show you what that looks like here. So this goes, there's 270 bridges that have open work candidates. But then when you get to the count of how many work candidates are open, there's 600 right now, because you'll see that there are 2 open work candidates on this first bridge. One of them is to clean and wash out the beam seating areas, and the other is to replace the joints, right? So in this case, I've taken the ability to write what I want, whatever queries I want, and I've turned this now into go and get the work candidates that are open for all of my bridges. And I've got this that I can filter down to, this is an example of it will jump to that bridge's condition, or I can click on it and map it, But if I wanted to say add a column here so I can filter down by region or admin area, then I just go in and change which columns are getting returned there so that I can make a list of, what are the work candidates for a given admin area, and then I can export it to Excel, right? So there's man, sky's the limit in terms of options to this. What kind of things do we want to do with this? This is one example. So this is, going through and looking at all of your work candidates. These are the work candidates that are in BRM right now. This is an even more exciting one. This one's fun. This one's going through my optimizations. Okay, so see here, I wrote the queries that return the latest scenario that's been run, or the second latest or third latest. This is going to take a little minute to load because this is getting a lot of stuff. I'll show it to you in just a second. But these are the optimizations that I ran. So this is a good example of the query behind this returns. It doesn't have to return a number. It doesn't have to return a percent. It can return text, but it's only expecting one thing to come back. In this case, what was the second most recent scenario that I ran? Now, what I like about this one is this is giving now what is the deck, super, and sub or covert rating of every bridge for every year in the model. And I can just take this and now export this to Excel and have all the data that's going on behind those optimizations and those other graphs, right? So there are things you can do with this also for your dashboards, helping your list of projects or project selection stuff, or the optimization stuff. Sky's the limit. It really is. This opens up a lot of neat things that you can do now with BRM. So hopefully this gives you kind of an example of how to set up the dashboards, enough that you can get in and start playing with it. If you have problems with your queries, of course, the first place to check is in, whether that's Oracle and you're using the SQL developer, or if you're using Microsoft SQL Server, then you're using the Server Management Studio. Go pull those up, run the query in there, and make sure that it works there first. I will speak from experience. I ran into a lot of, I was missing a closing bracket. I was missing a quotation mark or an equal sign. So, that's the first thing to do to check if you're having problems. If it's working there, but it's not working in your dashboard, then send us the queries in a help ticket and we can take a look at them. So then, I fully expect this to be a thing at the next user group. If you come up with a great idea of a dashboard, you have a dashboard that tells the inspectors when they need the crane. You have a dashboard that tells, I don't know, like I really can't think of all the ways you're going to use this. And so I'm excited for you to tell me show me what kinds of graphs you come up with or what kinds of tables you come up with in the future. I'm very excited to see what everyone comes up with and what everyone finds useful. There's one last question there. Brian asked, can you do what treatment was selected in that scenario? I mean, yeah, do I want it as a column? Because like obviously something happened to this bridge at that year of the model. It went from a 4 to a 9. So I assume there was like a replacement went on in here. So yeah, I could add columns to just add in, was there a project that was selected? Yeah, like at this point, it really becomes, what do you need it to do? And I'm sure you can find a way to do it. Or talk to us. We can talk you through how to do it. If you don't have time to deal with it and you just want us to do it for you, that is also an option. Throw a service unit in the bucket and we'll write as many, you need a bunch of queries for dashboards. You want us to make some dashboards for you. Just tell us what you need it to do. So really exciting new feature, if you can't tell. I'm excited to see what you come up with for this. I'm sure load ratings and optimizations and work candidates are just the tip of the spear. You could do like NBI checks. You could do, data quality checks. How many of our bridges have unknown scour? Like that's a really easy one to put on a dashboard, right? How many bridges still have the temp codes in their translation to the new Fed codes? Like we're going to find uses for this. This is going to be really neat.
Zach, there was a question that I answered by typing, but might be worth just mentioning a couple things about. The anonymous attendee asked, is the dashboard creation tied only to SQL? And I shared that the counts and table grid are currently relying on SQL queries. Charts are set up using parameters. I don't know if we showed that charts can interact with the table grid though. Without user provided SQL queries, you can subscribe a table grid to a chart. But another thing I wanted to bring up is, yeah, there is some technical overhead for setting up a dashboard. And first of all, there is a SQL query guide that I think should have been provided to users that I wrote myself that might answer some questions about creating SQL queries if you have some SQL knowledge. And if not, I think maybe you may be able to provide some amount, or may be able to offer some support for queries in the future. I'm not sure if that's fleshed out or not.
Why? Oh, because I said
and of course,
copy it. That's what I'm doing. I'm kicking copy button. Sorry.
And of course, you have the default bridge dashboard there. If you want to just take a look at how we put that one together, we tried to make those SQL queries nice and nice and clear for you.
All right. Well, awesome. We looks like we've got through all the questions, and we can give you back 2 minutes of spare time to your day. So thank you everybody for attending. Thank you for your questions and putting up with our hopefully contagious enthusiasm. And we look forward to seeing what you come up with. Please show us the features that you start using this for, so that it gives us more ideas of what to show other people or what to add as default dashboards going forward, because everyone seems to be using this. Let us know. With that, thank you, and have a good day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.